In the last video, we talked about the employment decision for a firm that operates with perfect competition in its labor market, that is, it's a wage taker, but imperfect competition in its product market, that is, it's a price maker. An example of this might be McDonald's. McDonald's can sell its Big Macs at higher prices and it won't lose all its customers. It could charge a lower price and it will gain customers. So it is a price maker. But McDonald's can also hire pretty much as much labor as it wants at whatever the market wage is. So McDonald's is a good example of this kind of scenario. Perfect competition in the labor markets, but imperfect competition in the product market. Now let's consider the opposite scenario, where we have imperfect competition in labor markets and perfect competition in product markets. To understand this, we first need to develop an understanding of labor market monopsony. You may not have heard the word monopsony before. Likely you've heard of its cousin, monopoly. Monopoly is a single seller of a product. And monopolists have the ability, because they're the only seller of a product, to raise the price and not lose that many customers. They have a lot of market power, allowing them to make a much higher price than if there were competition. A labor market monopsony is not a single seller in product markets, but instead is a single buyer in labor markets. Meaning this is a firm that is the sole buyer, demander of labor. And as a result of being the only buyer of labor, they have market power. But of course, they want to use that market power to push down the wage. They want to pay a lower wage. You know, a monopolist has the attitude of, if you want to get the good, you got to pay a higher price. Well, a monopsonist has the attitude of, if you want a job, you got to take a lower wage. In both cases, you have a form of market power. The firm is dictating prices for the product, monopoly. The firm is dictating wages for workers, monopsony. One employer that has wage making ability. This is going to create an upward sloping labor supply curve. Let me show you this briefly and we'll come back. But if you look at our model here, notice the supply curve the firm sees for labor is upward sloping. And it's going to be equal to the marginal wage cost. Another way of putting this is that in order for the firm to attract more workers, they're going to have to pay a higher wage. The total wage cost the firm pays, we know from before, is the labor employed times the wage. We also learned before that the marginal wage cost is the change in the total wage cost divided by the change in labor. Let's look at some numbers here. Let's say there is a firm in a small town, and they happen to be the only employer. While this might seem unrealistic, there have been plenty of real-world examples. During the industrial era in our nation's history, it wasn't uncommon to have a town literally come into existence because a manufacturing plant set up operation there. As a result, the manufacturing plant was the only employer in that town. That's a labor market monopsony. You want a job, you got to sell your labor to them. They're the only buyer. Assume that this is the case in our example. Assume that a wage is $1, and while these numbers are unrealistic now, if we stick with the early 20th century example, this might be comparable. If the firm pays a wage of $1 an hour, they would get 0 workers. To attract a first worker, to get a supply of labor, they would need to raise the wage to $2. To get a second worker, they would need to raise the wage to $3, so on and so forth. It's important to note that the firm cannot force people to work for them. So if the firm tried to pay 0, for example, no one would show up. In fact, here, even if the firm tries to pay $1, people won't show up. They won't supply their labor. But they will start to see an increase in supply of labor as the wage goes up. Hence, we get this upward sloping supply curve for the firm. And the firm is going to see a total wage cost calculated this way. So if they hire one worker at $2, it's 1 times 2. If they hire 2 workers at $3, it's 2 times 3, so on and so forth. So this is the total wage cost. Note that the marginal wage cost is calculated as the change in the total wage cost divided by the change in labor. So for example, if this firm goes from 1 to 2 workers, it's going to have to pay a higher wage of $3 to get those 2 workers. The total wage cost goes from 2 to 6, meaning that the change in total wage cost of that second worker is 4 divided by the change in labor. Well, you went from 1 to 2, so it's 4. Let's go from 2 to 3 workers. If the firm goes from 2 to 3 workers, its total wage cost goes from 6 to 12. The change in total wage cost is 6 divided by the change in labor, 1 more worker. 6 divided by 1 is 6. So we get the marginal wage cost through these calculations. Note that the marginal wage cost is represented as the upward sloping supply curve the firm sees, so they're one and the same. It's important to keep in mind that the firm must pay a higher wage in order to attract more labor. But it's also important to note that in order for the firm to get labor, they're going to see their marginal wage cost of labor go up faster than the wage. For example, to get a 5th worker, they would need to raise the wage from $5 to $6. But their marginal wage cost is going to go from 8 to 10. That's why in our illustration here, the firm supply curve, which is equal to the marginal wage cost curve, is higher than the supply curve that actually exists in society. That's equal to the wage. Okay. Again, this 5th worker, you have to pay them $6 in order to attract them to the job. But the marginal wage cost of that 5th worker is 10. In our illustration here, let's say this is the 5th worker. Well, the marginal wage cost is up here at point A, but the actual wage is here. The marginal wage cost of that 5th worker is 10, but the wage is 6. The marginal wage cost is 10, but the wage is 6. Okay, so that's taking this tabular format and placing it in our graphs. Thus, we now have a monopsonist, an imperfectly competitive labor market, where the supply curve that the firm sees is different, higher than the supply curve that society sees. Next, we're going to assume that we have perfect competition in product markets. This shows up on our demand side for labor as an equality of the marginal revenue product and the value of marginal product. Let's go through the process of employment. The firm uses marginal revenue product and marginal wage cost to determine how many workers to employ. They will continue to employ workers so long as the marginal revenue product exceeds the marginal wage cost, which means they'll employ to this point. Okay? Each of these workers up to quantity firm has a marginal revenue product greater than the marginal wage cost. This difference here would be profit added by employing the workers. So that's the firm employment. Now let's look at society's perspective. Society says that value of marginal product is what matters. That's what we should consider when looking at whether to employ a worker or not. And the wage is what's most important from their standpoint, because that's the amount that it would take to get the worker to show up. So society says we should continue to employ to where the value of marginal product equals the wage. They say this is the value of marginal product, this is the wage, go all the way to here, QS. note that for the firm, that would be a bad outcome. The firm sees these points from their employment decision to society's employment decision. They see the value of marginal product, they see the marginal revenue product as less than the marginal wage cost. So they actually see these workers as having more cost to them as a firm than the benefits, the revenue that would come in. So they see losses here. They therefore will not employ these workers. We're left with a similar outcome as we had in the previous example. We have the firm choosing a profit maximizing employment level that is below what society would want. We have an underemployment of resources, labor, from society's perspective. Same outcome, but different reason. In the first real-world example, we had an underemployment of resources, labor, because of imperfect competition in the product market. In this example, we have an underemployment of resources, labor, because of imperfect competition in the labor market. Really, what we're saying is if you have imperfect competition in the labor market or in the product market, you will get an inefficient allocation of labor. You will get an underemployment of labor from society's perspective. The firm is in charge of the employment decision, and they will choose to hire less people than is optimal from society's point. In both cases, the firm will choose to employ a certain level of workers, but there are workers out there that would be willing to work for a wage, and they would generate a value to customers in society through their output that would justify employment. But the firm doesn't look at the value that the workers produce for society. They look at the value that the workers produce for them, and that's called marginal revenue product. Similarly, the firm doesn't look at the wage at which the workers are willing to show up to work for. The firm looks at the marginal wage cost. This brings about inefficiency, but it also brings about a more real-world perspective, because the starting model that we built was perfect competition in both product and labor markets. While that could happen, it would be very rare. What is most likely is imperfect competition in one or both of the markets we've studied, either in the labor or in the product market or both. And that creates this inefficient outcome that leads to effectively labor being underemployed. But it also leads to what we see in the real world. In fact, when we look at real companies, like the example of McDonald's I gave you, we would say they are inefficient in their employment of labor. But there may not be such a thing as perfect efficiency in the real world. So it's always a matter of degree. How inefficient are they? Are we getting a large amount of underemployment of labor because of McDonald's? Or are we getting a little bit of inefficiency, a little bit of underemployment of labor? That's the real question. What's an example of this one? If McDonald's was an example of imperfect competition in product markets, but perfect competition in labor markets, well, what would this be? Well, again, the best example is probably in that small town where you have one factory that is the sole purchaser of labor. So you get imperfect competition in the labor market. But it's very possible that what that company is producing, let's say they're producing steel. Well, steel sells in a highly competitive market. So we could say that the steel mill in the small town operates with perfect competition in its product market. It takes the price of its product as given by the market, but it has a lot of control over labor, where it is a monopolist. Okay, so hopefully that helps. In the last video, we'll do some examples of all four to wrap this up.